Former CIA analyst Ray McGovern. We'll take a short break. When we come back, the COVID origins, spy balloons and lethal aid to Russia. Western media has no shortage of defamatory stories on China. We hear from experts to unpack the purpose of this apparent smear campaign. Stay with us. Is there a defamation campaign on international mainstream media against China? Reporting on China has a track record of negativity, but things seem to be reaching new lows over the past few years. The most recent example being the origin of COVID-19, a stale dish, on top of a series of accusatory stories, the so-called spy balloons, the pending provision of lethal weapons to Russia, and the collection of information via TikTok, all without convincing evidence. How much is this a spontaneous phenomenon? Is there a deliberate propaganda war heating up against China? If so, what's the objective, and how can people be better informed when they're living under the media hegemony of the few big names? I'm pleased to be joined from Shanghai by Professor Huang, University Professor and Director of the Institute of the U.S. and Pacific Studies at Shanghai International Studies University, and from Massachusetts, the U.S. by Professor Robert Ross, Department of Political Science at Boston College. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, Professor Huang, let me go to you. As I said, negative stories are almost off the charts, one would feel, especially since the COVID broke out. There is definitely no shortage. And if you look at any story, most likely there is a negative twist. Why is that? And what do you think is behind this increasing favorable coverage of China?
Yes, it's very frustrating at reading all the mainstream report on China outside the United States. It's very negative. It is indeed consciously or not kind of demonstrating China by all means. And I think that what's behind it is, number one, this ideological or political correctness, saying that whatever China is doing is wrong because China is on the wrong side of history. And second, I think there is a kind of a conscious or subconscious arrogance behind it, saying that I'm right, you're absolutely wrong. And last but not the least, of course, there is a bias. The bias is a bit complicated, but if I have to, mention one single factor about this bias, is this political correctness. Saying whatever you do, if you're not on my side, you're absolutely wrong. So I'm entitled, or even kind of it's kind of mission to describe China as a dark place, as a source of the problems. But as a matter of fact, we're living in a world that is very different. All of us are different.
Do you see this as a campaign, Professor Huang?
I do not believe there is an organized campaign, but there is such an environment which the U.S.-China relationship is very much poisoned by all this hoopla in the United States and West at large, that China is, named a major, the consequential challenger to the system. And that actually is to see China as as I said, is on the wrong side of history. This kind of judgment is really behind.
Yeah. Professor Ross, what is your opinion to this question? And also, what could be the consequence of such a phenomenon, whether it is a conscious, coordinated campaign or just, what happened when you have a myriad of very deep ideological bias and, invested interest or manipulation by some?
First, I think it would be a mistake to assume the United States is the only country with negative reportage on the other. After all, we're all accustomed to People's Daily and Huang and Xinhua talking about American hegemonism and capitalism ever since 1949. It's never changed. So that both sides are wrapped up in images of the other that are not particularly helpful. And you talk about the monopoly or the single voice of the American media. Nothing can compare to the single voice of Xinhua or the Chinese Information Office of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's, a larger context. Now, yes, the United States is, of course, concerned about the rise of China. Any country would, and China has a policy of challenging American coalitions, American alliances, and it's been working very hard to undermine American ability to cooperate with Europe regarding China and elsewhere. And so when the United States sees China trying to drive a wedge, if you will, to the United States and Europe, it tends to come out with some negative reportage on China, much the way the United States has had reported negatively in the Chinese media on, say, our relations with the Philippines or South Korea. So there's if you will, a battle going on between these two countries that very much reflects the bipolar competition between the rising power and the status quo power. It's quite unfortunate, I would agree, because it undermines the ability of people in both countries to have an informed understanding of the relationship, rather than having both countries' leaders take the lead in leading their people toward certain conclusions rather than allowing them to think for themselves.
Professor Huang, what is your reaction to Professor Ross's remarks?
I agree with him. I think this is kind of what we call the mirror effect. That is, both sides try to, take the other side not as an enemy, but as kind of a target of negative descriptions. This reminds me of 1980s or 1990s. I think if either you read the Chinese media or read American reportage, there's some beautiful or positive sense that talk about each other, but that now this kind of sense totally disappeared. Indeed, I think that the Western media, mainstream media, demonize China, but if you look at the Chinese report, it's also quite negative on the United
So
States.
here's
But
the
what I have to argue here is that who initiated this first. I think it's all initiated by Donald Trump's administration. After that, it's just going down.
Well, if
down
you
the
talk
hill.
about, yeah, if you talk about earlier times, like what Professor Ross just mentioned, I mean, China was not the one who went and, provided weapons or fueled the civil war or, tried to take part of the pie from China. China was on the defending side, Mr. Ross.
Well, I think Huang Jing makes an important point.
You attack someone and you would expect someone to fight back.
I think you asked me a question, so let me answer here.
Yes.
I think Professor Huang Jing made an important point about the Trump administration. So that if you're trying to find when the United States first began to see the rise of China as a problem, begin to adopt policies to resist the rise of China in a very proactive way, it would be the Trump administration. And there are various policies the United States adopted, beginning in about 2017, 2018 in particular, and that would include our trade policies, our tech policies, our relationship with Taiwan, and they're all designed, if you will, to maintain the status quo of American security, because as China rises, it necessarily challenges the status quo, and it necessarily challenges.
So it is justified for the media to go very negative on China without substance, without evidence.
I don't think I said that. The question was, what I was trying to explain is what in both countries there's a tendency of the monopolization of the media, or I shouldn't say that, the single voice of the media to have negative views of the other. Now, of course,
well, exactly. I was saying that what is the reason for that? If the United States or if the media, let's not go back too far. If the media in the West, not since the Trump time, step up the kind of attacks, accusations, lies about China, you wouldn't see China being so angry and ratcheting up its rhetoric as well, Mr. Ross.
And we'll give you an example here. The Chinese have protected their most important strategic industries since 1949. State-owned enterprises have occupied the high ground of Chinese security industries since the founding of the People's Republic. And so that when we see the Americans doing the same now with our high technologies, China's quite critical without understanding that it's been doing the same. So neither side, if you will, Huang Jing is right, there's a mirror process going on here. We see the flaws of the other without seeing the common behavior in ourselves. And that's a very typical behavior, typical attitude in international politics. We see ourselves as always on the defensive, and see the other as always being aggressive, belligerent. America and China
But
are
we're
not
not
immune.
making up things. But we're not making up things. Professor Huang, let me give the parole to you.
I think that yes, there are something that is the report is not complete. At least it's incomplete. Sometimes we say the incomplete story is even worse than lies, and also there's out and out lies. And I realized, for example, I was accusation about Xinjiang and so on and so forth. Yes, there are some bad policies, wrong policies adopted by Chinese government against that area, but it's a far cry from the so-called genocide and so on and so forth. And also on the Hong Kong issue, of course, if the same demonstration or violent demonstration happening in any major cities in the West, that will be dealt very, very harshly. But in China, it has become kind of human right. This kind of, I think, misleading or even distorted report, or even simply out of the make-up stories, that is, I think that has a very bad effect on the Chinese people in general. I remember when I was young, there was very positive thinking about United States, but now that turns all negative. I think that's really bad.
Okay. Well, the global audience is not sharing sharing similar views, according to latest data that I checked just now. Global trust in mainstream media in the United States and the UK have fallen, and people should ask why. Well, with that, we come to the end of this discussion. I must thank Professor Robert Ross from Boston College and Professor Huang Jing from Shanghai International Studies University. Thank you very much for being on the show. With that, we come to the end of this live discussion on CGTN from The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.